Hi there, my name is Beau, and I'm here with Performance Designs to give a seminar that I was supposed to be giving at PIA Symposium this year in Reno. Unfortunately, I hurt myself, so I did not end up going to Reno. Therefore, I get to give it to you all on the internet. Um, I hope you're checking this out on YouTube or Facebook or wherever, and I hope you are able to share it with anybody who this might help at the drop zone or wherever. So let's go ahead and begin. Again, the title of this seminar it would be "Observations from the Road: Downsizing, Common Situations from Under the PD Tent, and How to Handle Them." Everybody's favorite, downsizing. It's never been solved before, so try and solve the problem. um, so a little bit about myself. My name is Beau Riebe. I started working for Performance Designs in 2016 as the U.S. tour rep. I was fortunate enough to travel the country, meeting hundreds and thousands of skydivers all over the country, going to different drop zones and handing out demos, interacting with people, helping people on their canopy progression, or just all in all have a better time under the parachute. So I did that for a couple of years. I traveled to 50 plus drop zones. It was like 54, 55 different drop zones, over 2,000 demos in that time. Uh, and then in 2020, I swapped to Flight One and became a Flight One Canopy instructor, where I still work and I do military instruction as well as some sport and some mutant instruction. But then I came back to Performance Designs in 2021 as the client relations rep. So that's more on the government, military side of things. I don't really get to interact with sport jumpers as much anymore, which is, kind of miss it. So I'm happy to be able to give this presentation and hopefully help you all out. I also was a member of the US Canopy piloting team at one time, and I have a quite a large background, obviously, now in canopy flying and canopy knowledge. So, wanting to give this presentation just as kind of an overview of how, I handled situations, how situations arose under the PD tent in terms of people asking to get a different parachute, get a smaller parachute. Should they be going to a smaller parachute? Um, so just, from my point of view, my perspective, how those situations looked when they're good, when they're bad, and how to handle them, and some, we'll be kind of like facing some myths here as well, and hopefully just making everyone more knowledgeable about downsizing, what that entails, as well as um, how to handle situations or how to safely approach this situation. So first off, when you're under the PD tent, it's not uncommon that someone will come up to you and say, "Hey, I want to try a smaller parachute," which is cool, great, groovy, love it. Uh, there are many different reasons that people want to try a smaller parachute. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But some of the common reasons are to go faster, sure. Some people have a fear of underloading. This is a really common one, super common. Some people just say that they want to have more fun, which is sweet. Who doesn't love having more fun? It's kind of why we skydive. Some people want to get more performance, which leads us into a whole different discussion of what is performance? What does that mean? We'll get to that a little bit. Some people want a smaller parachute because they want the ability to jump in higher winds. And some people say, well, it's time. So I'm ready. It's time. I've been doing this one for a while. I'm ready for the next one. So again, these are all some good reasons, some maybe not so good reasons. I think every situation is a little bit different, but I just want to address kind of each of these and discuss how it might impact one's decision making, or some key factors that play into each of these. So the first one would be when somebody says they want to go faster. So what part of their flight, or what part of your flight, do you mean you want to go faster? Do you want your landings to be faster? Do you want your, like, the time from opening the parachute to getting to the ground, that part to be faster? Do you hate the canopy flight and you just want to get down as fast as you can? Do you want to get back to the drop zone faster, with more altitude, with less time, spent getting back to the drop zone. There's a lot of different parts of the canopy flight. And when someone just says, I want it to go faster, you need to make sure you're understanding what specifically they're discussing. So I want to quickly just emphasize the difference between airspeed and ground speed. So the airspeed, we may all know this, we may not know this, but the airspeed is essentially it's the speed of the air relative to the wing flying through the air. So it's the speed of the air over the wing. That's our airspeed. Our ground speed is relative to our movement across the ground. So, quick little analogy to really make sure that everybody understands this would be this is one that's been used before and it's a great one. So, imagine you're on a moving walkway, and the moving walkway, like at airports, for example, the moving walkway is traveling, um, whatever, 3 miles per hour in this direction. And I am walking on the walkway at 3 miles per hour. So I am moving myself 3 miles per hour. I get on the moving walkway. My combined speed, the walkway plus myself moving, puts it at 6 miles per hour. If you look out the window, it would look like you're traveling 6 miles per hour. So that's ground speed. The movement that I am actually doing, my physical walking, is still only 3 miles per hour. That's airspeed. So if I reverse that, if I turn around and now I'm walking against the moving walkway, I'm still walking at 3 miles per hour physically, but the moving walkway is kind of countering my motion. So if I look out the window, it looks like I'm going nowhere, right? So that's my ground speed would be 0 because I'm walking this way at 3, the walkway's moving against me at 3. I've got a bunch of people coming toward me that are yelling at me. But so in this case, my airspeed that I'm physically still walking is 3 miles per hour. However, because of that moving walkway, it looks like I'm doing 0. So that's my ground speed. So again, airspeed is the air moving over the canopy, that speed. So we always have this kind of constant airspeed unless we're messing with it with our inputs or difference in drag or this or that. The ground speed is affected by the wind. So when we talk about doing things faster, we also have to recognize that the atmospheric conditions, what the wind is doing, where the wind is, how strong it is, uh, plays a large factor in one's perception of speed. Um, so it's not always that people want to go faster. Uh, if you jump with people or know people that say that they hate jumping when there's no wind in zero wind, that's because the true airspeed of their canopy, with no wind affecting it, might be a little too fast for them. Um, it's unfortunately rare that we get very zero windy days. It's just, common that we get some wind. So when you are considering downsizing or moving to the next more a faster canopy, you need to incorporate what is the wind at your drop zone doing most frequently. Because if you feel really good in a 15-mile-per-hour wind and you downsize, and then the next day it's 0 miles per hour, holy moly, your landings are about to be way faster. So keep that in mind, all right? Um, Definitely want to make sure that we're understanding at all times the difference between our airspeed and our ground speed. And then the last thing is, if we do truly want more airspeed, how can we, as the canopy pilot, get more speed from the canopy? What can we do to increase our airspeed under that parachute? A lot of different things, but I'm not here to coach you on that. Just here to make sure that you recognize that we can do things to get more speed from our parachute, more airspeed. Moving on, it is not uncommon that people come up and they say, I'm underloading my parachute. If you had to, you know, imagine a person that may feel like they're underloading their parachute, it's typically going to be a smaller person, right? Somebody lighter weight, skinnier build, whatever. Somebody that thinks that they're underloading their parachute. And now the question is, why do they think they're underloading their parachute? Oftentimes, it's because they've been told that they need a certain wing loading. They need this wing loading to jump. Why do they need that wing loading? What about that wing loading makes somebody better or worse or capable of jumping or not capable of jumping? And the real answer is that it depends on the atmospheric conditions. It depends on the winds. So there is no such thing as underloading a parachute. Yeah, I said it. Actually, shout it. Shout it to the moon. There's no such thing as underloading a parachute. Um, the minimum wing loading on our Canopy wing loading charts, the minimum always says VLC, which means varies with landing conditions. I would generally say that most people are not comfortable on final if they have less than a 1-to-1 glide ratio. So if their flight, if their glide, if they're forward and down, if that ratio is at a 45 degrees or steeper, most people are generally not comfortable there. That doesn't mean that you feel that way. Some people are okay landing straight down. How many of us have turned on the final and just rode that elevator straight down? And when we do that, typically we're going to say, yep, that was too windy and I don't think I'm going to jump again. So the lighter the wing loading, the more the more important the landing conditions become. How about that? So what are some effects of a light wing loading? Well, the openings probably have no change in general. Maybe they're slightly slower simply because there's less weight weighting those lines and getting the parachute to open. There's less of a loading under that. But I think in general we could agree that there's not much change with a light wing loading. Handling, so your inputs, how quick does it turn? It's going to be more gradual. So it's going to be a little bit more forgiving, more a little bit slower, more gradual, more user friendly, some may say. The airspeed, remember, airspeed is going to be less than a higher wing loading. So that means that if you are just comparing the same parachute, bigger parachute, higher wing loading, excuse me, to lower wing loading, that that lower wing loading is going to have a less as or a slower airspeed. Okay, and the landing, which by that I mean the flare. There's really going to be no change in the flare technique, the flare dynamics. You're still executing the flare essentially the same, um, and you most likely are going to have an easier time standing up or running out or walking out your landings because you're going to have less speed to begin with coming in, so it'll be easier to slow it down. It is okay to have a light wing loading. I think that's the biggest takeaway from this wing loading section. I personally have jumped canopies. I jump them very frequently, loaded at a point 0.6. PD has tested them, loaded at roughly point 0.3, and landed, I guess successfully tested, that's what I should say, and landed the parachutes loaded at like a point 0.3. Um, and again, I jumped them very frequently with military clients, loaded at roughly a point 0.5 to point 0.6. That's a pretty low wing loading. That means that our speed is pretty low, but the parachute still opens fine, still flies fine, still handles just great, still lands great, does everything I need it to do just fine. So there's no pitfall, there's no disadvantage of a lighter wing loading. And in fact, I would argue that somebody who jumps on a lighter wing loading and masters flying their parachute and managing their position relative to the drop zone to their landing area manages that with a lighter wing loading where they're more affected by the winds is going to become a better canopy pilot and a better skydiver than somebody who has the luxury of always having penetration into the wind and being able to move their parachute, fly around the sky wherever they want. As I said, the conditions become more important. when you are at a lighter wing loading. You need to make sure that you are understanding what the winds are doing, where they're coming from, and how strong they are at all altitudes, including your canopy altitudes. So conditions become more important. Unfortunately, here's the only unfortunate side. There may be your wind limits at a lighter wing loading may be less than somebody at a higher wing loading. And that kind of gets back to your tolerance on final approach to handle how much you can give with that steep glide ratio. Do you not care about going to 1-to-1? Do you prefer it a little flatter? Are you okay steeper than a 1-to-1? This is kind of all personal, right? So this is where we need to kind of establish our own ability level and our own tolerances for that, for conditions. And then this last part on the slide talks about the instruction that the jumper learns. So this is getting back to that point that the jumper at a lighter wing loading has to have the ability to have a better flight plan, or to have an appropriate flight plan to where they know that they are staying upwind of the target at all times and they're managing their position relative to the target, because they cannot fight the wind. So instead, they have to use the wind. Ooh, use the wind. Very cool. We have things nowadays, I think they're becoming more popular, called drifting patterns, where we're turning onto our base leg sooner, and and by sooner I mean more upwind. We're using the wind to allow us to drift to where we want to turn on the final, rather than everybody flying downwind of the target and having to crab over to our final turn point. We're doing things that are smarter than that nowadays, and that allows lighter jumpers more opportunities to succeed. So if you are a lighter jumper and you have not ever thought about how your wing loading should change your flight plan, time to get with the canopy coach and ask. Sometimes people on light wing loading say, well, I just need to downsize. I'm ready for the next parachute because I'm underloading this one. So what are the effects of a smaller parachute? On openings, become more demanding. Body position and packing techniques all become more demanding. That parachute is more sensitive during its inflation sequence, and therefore, if you are not as disciplined in the harness, if you're not as square or tightened up, then you're going to start to see some problems for sure, or you could see some problems. The handling becomes more sensitive, obviously. Yeah, the handling's in the harness is more sensitive. Your harness weight, your body position, the toggles, the risers, the front risers, back risers, all this stuff becomes more sensitive. Airspeed is going to increase as we get to a smaller parachute. So you're going to descend through the air faster. You're also going to move forward faster across the ground. So you are now coming down quicker, which means you have less time to analyze things, figure things out, assess what the wind is doing, assess where your other jumpers are. Um, but you are also moving forward faster across the ground. So you're getting places quicker, which isn't always a good thing. And then the landings are going to be faster, obviously. They're going to be more dynamic. They're going to be less forgiving to any mistakes that you make. Uh, Symmetry. How often do you see people landing their parachutes and they go to flare and they kind of veer off to one side or another? They run out their landing and all of a sudden their hands are up and they're sprinting. And I mean, it was an athletic move, but was it a proper move? And the answer is no, it wasn't. I think I think a lot of people would recognize that those mistakes exist, probably because they were not handled on a larger parachute. So when you go to the smaller parachutes, the mistakes that you are making are going to become larger. Okay? So here's a little science talk about smaller canopies. So we know that smaller canopies have shorter lines. If you didn't know that, now you do know that. Smaller parachute, the lines get shorter, the person gets closer to the parachute. Um, what happens as the lines get shorter is that we need less input to get larger movements from the wing. There's a couple reasons for this. One reason is simply because a larger parachute has to move more air as it moves around, right? It takes up like more surface area, more square footage. 170 square feet of parachute, if it's going from there to there, it has to move 170 square feet of air to get over there. That's just like a ballpark. But uh, alternatively, a 120 square foot parachute only has to move 120 square feet of air. So it's less air that has to move, and therefore it can move there quicker and faster and easier. The other reason is that as the lines get shorter, if you think about maybe like a cuckoo clock moving from straight up and down to 45 degrees out. Cuckoo clock that starts up here and hangs way down here, moving to 45 degrees. That's whatever it is, a fair distance. If we have a shorter cuckoo clock moving to 45 degrees, it does not have to go nearly as far, right? Okay, so the actual numbers behind this, I took the line length, the A line, center A line of a Sabre 3 190 and a Sabre 3 135, and I figured out the arc length to get it from vertical over your head to 45 degrees out to the side for that center A line. And for a Sabre 3 190, that line has to move almost 9.5 feet from here to get over there at 45 degrees. On a Sabre 3 135, that line has to move 7.5 feet to get from that straight overhead to 45 degrees. So again, kind of like the cuckoo clock, like from down here, long cuckoo clock, big swing, big arc, short cuckoo clock, smaller arc. Right. So again, less input, it gets there faster, and gets there easier, and then things become even more aggressive from there. Some people want to downsize because they want to get more performance. Back to that. And now let's talk about quickly what performance means. Well, we all have different definitions of it. If you talk to some people, they care about opening performance, and that's all they care about. If you talk to big way jumpers, they may want the ability to get back or to, have good openings, and then they're concerned about getting separation, vertical separation, because there's so many other jumpers around them. So a canopy with long control range or a wide control range. If you talk to AFFIs or videographers, they end up opening long ways away. And so they're going to want a canopy that's able to make it back from a long spot easier. If you talk to accuracy jumpers or crew jumpers, they're going to have different means, or free flyers might have different um, standards of performance. So we all have different definitions. So it's obviously important to kind of figure out that definition, what the person is looking for, what you are looking for in the performance of your parachute. And then the next question is, have we truly maxed out the performance of the canopy you are flying? Well, unfortunately, the answer is almost always no. I think it's a common pitfall that most of us fall into at some point in our skydiving career, of asking the parachute to give us more performance rather than increasing our own abilities and relying on our own abilities to gain that performance from the parachute. Good example of this is my friend Jimmy Trainer. He goes by Jimmy T. He's the man. And he started test jumping parachutes when he was like 10 years old. He's been jumping a long time. He has almost 40,000 skydives. Anyway, in the early 2000s, or late 90s, he was jumping a stiletto. And Jimmy has probably anywhere from 8 to 10,000 jumps on a stiletto. And he was telling me this, that it wasn't until he got to about 2 to 3,000 jumps on a certain size stiletto, it was like a 120, on just that size, that he finally felt like he actually understood the performance range of the parachute and how he could get everything from that canopy that he wanted. Now, I don't expect everybody here to do 2,000 jumps on every size of every parachute they're going to jump. But I do expect you to recognize that there is almost always more you can learn. And when you feel like you've learned the skill or the technique, apply that skill or technique to different situations that you might find yourself in. And that just takes time. More jumps, more time. So, what does a canopy progression mean? This is a common thing where I feel like people look at canopy progression and they only focus on the next step of the parachute. What is the next parachute that I'm going to be jumping? What is the next parachute? I'm jumping this parachute now. Sweet. What is the next parachute that I get to jump? And instead of doing that, I think it's, generally a good widespread practice to look at it from maybe like a skill and a maneuver mentality as well as a canopy size type mentality. They're all kind of factors that should be played together. So from a skill or maneuver mentality, these are just some possible examples that I've listed up here. Like I've mastered flat turns. I feel really good doing every type of flat turn, and I know when I want to use them and how to use them appropriately. If you didn't master them on this whatever larger parachute, when you go down to the smaller ones, it's going to be harder to master them. I've mastered symmetrical flares. If you are jumping a parachute and you cannot flare it symmetrically, don't take any offense to this. You probably should have learned the symmetrical flare on the one size up or two sizes or a little bit more forgiving of a parachute. And that's okay if you're part in doing if that's okay if you're in this like progression and you're still learning these things, right? You don't expect to always be mastering them right away. These are things that take time. So another possible one is I can confidently level out my canopy on rear risers. This is just a possibility. I'm not telling everybody here that they have to go land on rear risers because I don't want people to crash in. But if you are if you have a goal of moving toward high performance flying, well, you may desire to land on rear risers someday. And if you wait until you're on that really small parachute to ever try it, well, it's going to be less forgiving. And let me tell you, the ground hurts. So, um, the last one was just, or the last couple are like, working with a canopy coach who's recommending the next level of the courses or landing accurately this many times in a row in these wind conditions, blah, blah, blah. And so instead of that constant mentality of like, what is next? I think it's always good to enjoy the ride, enjoy the progression, and focus on what you can do right now. And the last part up here is that it actually requires dedicated jumps to progress. You can't always just learn this stuff at the end of your really sick zoo dive. You can try, but most likely it's going to require dedicated jumps, hop and pops, high pulls, whatever the case, canopy courses, this and that, in order to truly master this stuff. So the next part of this is just talking about some different perspectives toward downsizing. Sometimes people will say to me that they come up with like a jump number perspective is what I'm calling this. So essentially they say I have this many jumps, so I should jump this size parachute. Okay, that's great. There are some pros to this type of perspective. One, it's quantifiable, it's measurable, it promotes lots of jumping, but there are some obvious cons as well, which is that it has no discussion of skill. What did you do on those 200 jumps, 100 jumps, 300 jumps? It sets false expectations that as soon as you get to this jump number, you can do this thing. And with that, it kind of gives false confidence. As a person, if you say, I have this many jumps, so I should do this thing. And I am a totally at fault in this realm. When I first was learning to skydive, my background was I started at the Air Force Academy, and I had about 500 jumps on a PD 253 and a 235, so they're big 7 cell parachute. 500 jumps though, it's quite a few, right? Well, that's all we were allowed to do, all we were allowed to jump. And when I finally got to go civilian skydiving, I was like, 500 jumps, that's a lot. I'm gonna get a triathlon 160 was my next parachute. And it was okay. It was fine. I did not hurt myself on it. I probably should have gotten something larger because going from a 235 or a 253 down to a 160 is quite the jump. But at the time, I was like, yeah, probably okay. I don't really know any different. And then that rig got stolen from the back of a friend's car. And the parachute I bought with about 700 jumps, 700 or 800 jumps, was a 119 Crossfire. So I went from 235 or 253 for 500 jumps to a 160 for maybe 100 jumps to a 119. But I have 800 jumps. I should be able to do this. Okay, and the next thing is that I had a bad landing, smashed my femur and my ankle. So I'm proof of having jump numbers and thinking, oh, I have this many jumps, I can do this thing is not a good way to do it. Okay. Uh, Luckily I was, all okay, healed up, came back, upsized after that incident, learned things properly after that incident, respected not only the ground but the parachute a lot more as well. So that's a fault with the jump number perspective. The other thing is an experience perspective. I can do this, so I should be jumping this size canopy. So the pros of this are that it promotes learning, it promotes like learning skills, learning techniques, because that's kind of what you're basing your decision on, is your ability to do something. And there are many downsizing checklists out there, uh, and it can kind of be used in combination with one of those. Performance designs and myself, I don't really like downsizing checklists because it's easy for somebody to simply check a box with no measure of how good they did that, how well they accomplished that skill, or how the execution was. You can't if you let's say for example, land on rear risers is on your checklist, and you go and you slam those rear risers down and you stomp on your butt and you say, I did it. I feel like we're missing a little bit from that. So we don't really use a downsizing checklist here at PD. We never have, and it's for that reason. But the skill experience perspective can be used in combination with a checklist of sorts. And then there are some obvious cons, is that it's hard to measure. Just because somebody said that they did something does not mean how well they did it. Normally that requires, some visual verification, watching a jumper, talking to other jumpers on the drop zone, listening to how this person is doing, listening to stories about this person, watching this person, all that stuff. And then it also leads to people's overconfidence in their own abilities. Definitely, like I landed on rear risers, so I'm ready for the next parachute. Now, beside the obvious dangers of crashing, there are more things. I feel like, you can tell somebody, oh, don't downsize because you're going to hurt yourself. But how often do people want to hear that? We take a risk at jumping out of airplanes. People every day in the real world tell you, don't skydive, you're going to hurt yourself. It's like, yeah, 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 right. I mean, maybe we will, hopefully never. But the point is that we do this sport that encourages us to push beyond what people think is capable, what people think we are capable of. So therefore, just simply telling somebody, "Hey, don't do this. You're going to hurt yourself," like obviously that does not work very well. So I've found the best responses are simply educating people and talking about downsides of downsizing too quickly. And this slide kind of gets to some of those things. So, in essence, the smaller the parachute, the more challenging it is to fly. Therefore, the better you become now, the better you will be later. If you are trying to learn maneuvers, to learn this or that, or whatever it is, the smaller parachute is going to make learning it harder. Okay? So learning things on larger parachutes and then taking that foundation of skill and that base and then applying those skills to every single size as you go down is what is going to make you a well-rounded skydiver. I think, I'll use again my own canopy progression. After I hurt myself and all that, I started to learn. I knew that I wanted to get into high performance canopy piloting, swooping. Yeah, I hate that word. Uh, but so I went to a one when I was on a 120 is when uh, I learned harness maneuvers. I learned front riser approaches. I learned front riser 90s. I learned front riser 270s. And I started messing around with some 450s. And I did them and I did them and I was working in a drop zone and I did them nonstop. And therefore, I, felt pretty comfortable with them, pretty good. And then when I went to the 107, I had those skills already. And then I just had to kind of relearn things, refigure it out on the smaller parachute. Then when I went down another size, again, I already had the foundation. I was able to kind of apply what I knew to this new vehicle. Um, so the point is that just rapidly downsizing and then trying to learn this stuff is actually going to be more difficult than learning it on the bigger parachutes and then applying those skills. And because whomever you may be talking to perhaps wants to be, a swooper at the drop zone, then I think making sure that people recognize that is a really good way to get them to clue into like, oh, okay, I actually need to learn these maneuvers on whatever parachute I'm flying right now, rather than going down and then trying to learn stuff later. And then the last thing on this slide is talking about how problems tend to happen when things go wrong. So whether you can land a parachute safely at your drop zone where you're jumping every day and the wind conditions are predictable and you know what's going on and you know the other jumpers around you, and things are going good and smooth, that's fantastic. But that shouldn't be the true test of your ability. It should be when things start to go wrong, when you start to have to make split-second decisions in the air and make the correct decision to help you to save yourself, to save the other people as well. So some various situations would be like an off landing or when the winds change on you, whether you're in the pattern or in your holding area or whatever. When there's traffic that surprises you out of nowhere. When you have a malfunction and now you are a couple, whatever, a mile or two or however far away from the drop zone and you're under a reserve parachute, whew, now you got to make these decisions. How to land safely. Where are you? What's going on? Or you just had some line twist that spun you out and now you're lower than you were before. Now you have to safely address the situation. And, the unfortunate reality is it's probably any combination of all of those. Like I said, it's a sad thing to say, but people tend to get hurt when things go wrong. So, don't only assess your ability when everything is going right. Just recognize that your ability also will be highly dependent on uh, when things are going wrong, how you address the situation. And a smaller parachute is just going to make everything that much more important that you react appropriately. So some other considerations would be simply for your other jumpers in the pattern. Somebody jumping a smaller parachute is going to get down sooner than they were if they were on a larger parachute. If this person is less experienced and sporadic, unpredictable, whatever, then they are going to be in the pattern, perhaps with more and more people of, intermediate to advanced experience. Do you want some Yahoo flying right next to you in the pattern that you don't trust and you don't know what they're doing? I don't think I do. So there's a consideration. Everyone looking out, for other jumpers as well. The reserve size. Where are you landing? As you go down in size of main parachute, typically your reserve will also be decreasing in sizes, especially as you're changing your container size, right? So if you are now jumping a much smaller reserve than you were before, and you have a malfunction and you're miles away from the drop zone and you have to land in somebody's backyard and there's alligators and crocodiles and they're snapping at you and people are throwing bananas at you and holy smokes, that's a lot going on and I really hope that you can stick that landing. So it's a good thing to consider though, is your reserve size as well. Um, Something that is common is that as we as we overcome mistakes, as we progress in our abilities, and then we go down in the size, we may see those same mistakes arise again. And if that's the case, there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to recognize that if I had a problem with an asymmetrical flare on a 210, but I kind of figured it out, then I go down to 190, you may experience that problem again. And you then may have to figure it out. At least you have the foundation of figuring it out on the 210. So when you go to that 190, you know to lock things back up, tighten your body position, get in that active position, feet knees together, symmetrical flaring down the body, whatever, right? That's just an example. Density altitude is another thing to talk about is if somebody jumps constantly at sea level and they are downsizing, fairly rapidly, or they are, maybe just doing it a little bit faster than people would recommend, and then they go up in elevation to a drop zone like in Colorado or Utah, they're going to have to deal with not only jumping at a higher elevation, that's also going to make, and a new drop zone, that's also going to make the parachute fly faster. And with that, density altitude is also affected simply by the temperature of the day. So even if you're jumping in the winter, let's say in the winter, and it's in calm temperatures, and then you feel good, you go to the next parachute. When the summer hits and the temperatures are higher and higher and higher, the density altitude, meaning the kind of like the the predicted or calculated altitude of the drop zone you're at, or elevation of the drop zone you're at, regardless of its physical elevation, but simply due to the atmospheric conditions, the altitude of that drop zone can be higher because of the heat. So the three things that affect our density altitude are heat, humidity, and elevation. And last thing to say is that upsizing is also cool. Uh, there are plenty of people out there that unfortunately just don't jump as much as they used to. They have other things going on in life. For whatever reason, they've slowed down and they are upsizing. And that is a cool thing to do because when you upsize, all those things I talked about earlier are going to get a little bit easier. Landings are going to get a little bit slower, handling a little bit more gradual, openings nice and easy. You're going to stay in the air longer, therefore, you'll be able to make decisions, you'll have more time to make decisions. So, take a look at how often you're going to be jumping and make an appropriate decision because upsizing is also pretty fun. Last, it's just some simple ways to respond. Last things that I would talk about. Somebody comes and asks you about these things. You can have this full discussion, but make sure that you inquire about what their goals are. Make sure you know what that person wants to do. Make sure that you discuss jumping experience with that person, their numbers, their currency, their skills, their where they've jumped, and what kind of courses they've taken. You need to get a good idea of that. Encourage learning. Again, you want the best for that person. You're not only here to say, hey, don't do this because you're going to get hurt. You're there to educate somebody so that they can make the decision to not do it on themselves. Give canopy exercises and drills for the first jumps, meaning that if somebody is jumping a new parachute and it's their first time doing it, go ahead. If you're a drop zone owner, if you're SMTA, if you're a caring friend, go ahead and say, hey, why don't we do a hop and pop? And why don't we just, practice some flares? Figure out kind of where how the wing flares. Figure out that toggle pressure. Figure out how it turns. Maybe we'll practice some flat turns. Maybe we'll practice some rear riser techniques, or we'll practice some pitch drills, or how quick it turns with the harness, with the riser, with the toggle. So give them some drills and exercises for their first jumps on a parachute. I don't typically recommend that somebody takes a canopy out for the first time and goes and does a zoo dive with it where they open at 2,500 feet and have to race down to the ground. There's really not a lot of time to actually learn that parachute before landing it. Anytime you go to a demo tent, I'm pretty sure the demo rep is going to recommend that you do a hop and pop with it, that you try to pull high at least, so that you can do some exercises and get to know the canopy. And then with that, provide honest feedback. Be truthful about what you're seeing with that jumper. And last is to be kind, because we're all in this together. We all want to have fun. We're all looking out for each other. There's nothing worse than when our friends get hurt. So try to avoid it. I hope that this was informational. I hope that you guys got something from this. Again, it's just, looking at ways to approach a downsizing situation and put some education toward it rather than just gut feel raw emotion, which I'm all about also. But it's a balance, right? So thank you very much. Hope you all have a fantastic skydiving season. Uh, you're welcome to message Performance Designs at any time if you have any questions about progression, about your progression, what you should be working on, what you should be um, flying or moving to, or how you should approach it. Always here to help. And other than that, have a great day. Thank you. See ya.